The chandeliers of the Charleston Harbor Resort Ballroom glittered like a ceiling of frozen sunlight. Crystal glasses clinked. Waiters moved between tables with polished ease, and soft jazz drifted through the room like something carefully rehearsed. It was the kind of wedding people talked about for years. My sister Emily stood in the center of it all, radiant in satin and lace, her hand resting on Daniel Brooks's arm, as if she had always belonged in a room like this. Daniel came from one of those Charleston families whose last name opened doors before you even knocked. His father owned half the shipping warehouses along the harbor, and tonight, everyone important seemed to be here. I stood near the back of the ballroom, beside a tall arrangement of white lilies, smoothing the sleeve of my navy dress. I had chosen it carefully, simple, elegant, quiet. My mother had warned me earlier that afternoon not to wear anything too noticeable. Tonight wasn't about me. A burst of laughter rose from the long table where my parents sat with Daniel's business associates. My mother, Diane Carter, leaned forward in her chair, glowing with the kind of pride she usually reserved for church banquets and family photos. Emily has always been the ambitious one, she said warmly to the table. She knew exactly what kind of life she wanted. The guests nodded approvingly. My father, Robert Carter, lifted his glass. "That girl's going places," he said. "Always has." Someone at the table glanced past them and noticed me standing a few steps away. "And this must be your other daughter?" the woman asked politely. My mother turned her smile, tightening just slightly when she saw me. "Oh, Olivia," she said lightly, waving her hand toward me as if I were part of the decor. "Don't mind her. She just cleans houses." A few people chuckled softly. My father added with the casual confidence of someone telling a harmless joke. "Keeps herself busy, you know. Nothing fancy." The laughter grew a little louder. "Just cleans houses." The words landed quietly, but they settled deep. I kept my smile steady. Years of practice had taught me how to do that. Across the table, one of Daniel's business partners raised his eyebrows in polite interest. "Cleaning services are hard work," he said diplomatically. "Oh, sure," my father replied quickly. "But it's nothing like what Emily's building with Daniel." More nods, more polite smiles. Then something shifted. Daniel Brooks had been standing beside Emily, half listening to the conversation while greeting guests. But when my mother said my name, Olivia, his attention snapped fully toward the table. He looked at me, not the quick, polite glance people usually give when they realize they've forgotten someone's name. This was different. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying my face, as if a memory had just surfaced. The conversation around the table continued, but Daniel wasn't listening anymore. He took a step closer, then another. The laughter at the table faded as he stopped beside my parents' chairs. He looked straight at me, and slowly, carefully, he said my name, Olivia Carter. Not like someone hearing it for the first time, like someone who already knew exactly who I was. For the first time that evening, the room around us went completely still. The music resumed after that strange pause, the band sliding back into a soft swing melody, as if nothing unusual had happened. People began talking again. Chairs shifted, glasses clinked. A wedding reception has its own momentum, and even the most awkward moments tend to dissolve under the weight of celebration. Daniel was quickly pulled away by another group of guests, and Emily tugged him toward the dance floor with a bright smile that restored the room's balance. Whatever had just happened, it passed like a ripple on water. I stepped back toward the edge of the ballroom, again returning to the quiet perimeter where I had spent most of the evening. From there, I could see everything clearly, without being seen too closely. Emily moved through the crowd, like she belonged in every photograph being taken. Her laughter carried easily across the room, and people leaned toward her as if her confidence were something warm they wanted to stand near. She had always been like that, even when we were children. At home, in Savannah, our parents kept an old photo album on the coffee table. Visitors loved flipping through it. Page after page of Emily's achievements filled those plastic sleeves, debate trophies, graduation ceremonies, internships, smiling professors. Every milestone had its own photograph. My pages looked different. A science fair ribbon, a soccer team photo where I stood in the second row, a few snapshots from summer jobs, me behind a lemonade stand, later pushing a lawnmower across someone else's yard. Nothing embarrassing, just smaller. Growing up, the difference rarely needed to be spoken aloud. It lived in the way conversations drifted. When relatives visited the first, questions were always for Emily. How were her grades? What college was she thinking about? Did she still want to study business? My turn came later, usually when someone remembered there were 2 daughters in the room. Olivia, what have you been up to lately? The question always sounded kind, but it also sounded like an afterthought. I had learned early that expectations were lighter for me, not because my parents were cruel people. They weren't. They simply understood Emily's world better than they understood mine. Emily followed a path everyone recognized: school internships, networking events, polished resumes. My path had started somewhere else entirely. At 19, I had taken my first cleaning job at a small motel outside Savannah. The owner needed help turning over rooms during the tourist season, and I needed money. It was supposed to be temporary. But temporary things sometimes become the foundation of everything that follows. Across the ballroom, a woman in a silver dress approached me with a polite smile. "You're Emily's sister, right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm Margaret Whitfield," she continued, extending a hand. "My husband works with Daniel's father at the Port Authority." Her grip was confident, practiced. "So what do you do, Olivia?" I felt the familiar pause settle between us. "I run a cleaning service," I said simply. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Oh," she said, "that must keep you busy." Busy. It was the kind of word people used when they didn't know what else to say. Margaret nodded politely and soon drifted back toward the crowd where conversation seemed easier. I remained near the lilies, watching the dance floor fill with couples. From the head table, my father laughed loudly again, retelling the same story about Emily's college scholarship that he had shared 3 times already that evening. The guests leaned in with interest. My mother listened with glowing pride. I wondered briefly what my page would look like if someone had bothered to photograph the last 10 years of my life. Not the small moments, the early mornings, the long drives, the quiet work no one ever saw. But weddings weren't the place for that kind of story. I slipped a hand into my purse and felt the smooth edge of a small object resting there, my Harbor Shine Services business badge. I carried it everywhere, out of habit, even tonight. Not because I expected to use it, just because it reminded me of something important. Across the room, Daniel Brooks had returned to the head table beside Emily. For a moment, he glanced across the ballroom again. His gaze paused when it reached me. Not curious, not polite, recognizing. Then someone spoke to him, and he turned away. But the look stayed with me long after. Dinner was served in careful courses, each plate delivered like a performance. Butter-soft, filet-bright vegetables arranged like art, tiny desserts that looked too pretty to touch. The kind of meal that made you sit up straighter without realizing it. I stayed near the edge of the room, stepping forward only when someone waved me over then retreating again when the conversation drifted back to people who mattered more. Emily and Daniel moved from table to table, collecting compliments and congratulations. Every few minutes, someone clinked a glass and called for another toast. My mother loved that part. She lived for moments when other people looked at our family with approval. By the time the main course was cleared, she was on her third story about Emily's drive, her voice carrying across the table like she wanted it to. "She's always been determined," Diane said, laughing lightly. "Even as a little girl, she used to say she'd marry a man who could take her places." A few of Daniel's friends chuckled. My father leaned back in his chair, pleased. Robert had that relaxed, satisfied look he wore whenever he felt he was being seen in the right light. One of the men at the table, gray hair, expensive watch, nodded politely. "And your other daughter?" he asked. "Olivia, right?" My father didn't even look for me at first. He just waved his hand, dismissive, toward the side of the room. "She just cleans houses," he said, like it was a harmless detail. "Keeps busy, makes her own little money." The table laughed again. Not loud, not cruel, the kind of laughter people offer to keep things comfortable. But it still stung. I felt my face heat, and for a moment, I considered walking out. Not dramatically, just quietly, slipping into the night like I'd never been here at all. Instead, I stayed, because leaving would have been one more way of agreeing that I didn't belong. Margaret Whitfield, Daniel's father's Port Authority connection, was seated nearby, and I saw her glance at me with something that looked like embarrassment on my behalf. She didn't interrupt, though. No one did. My mother smiled like she had done something charming. "Work is work," she added brightly. "Olivia's always been hands-on, like I was painting birdhouses in the garage." One of the women at the table tilted her head. "So do you work for a company, dear, or is it just you?" I walked a little closer, still holding my wine glass with both hands, like it gave me something steady to grip. "I own my business," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's called Harbor Shine Services." A brief pause followed, the kind of silence that hangs in the air while people decide whether they care. "Oh," the woman said. "That's nice." "Nice again." My father chuckled. "See, busy." Then he turned back to the men, already moving on. That was when I heard it, a small detail tossed out, like nothing but sharp enough to catch. One of Daniel's friends leaned toward Robert and said, "Harbor Shine. That sounds familiar. Isn't that the name that's been on those staff badges at the Harborview properties?" The words landed differently than everything else tonight. Staff badges. My fingers tightened around my glass. Inside my purse, I could almost feel the smooth edge of my own Harbor Shine badge, tucked away like a private truth. My father blinked, confused. "Badges," he repeated, like he hadn't heard correctly. "Oh, I might be mixing it up," the man said quickly, already backpedaling. "There are so many vendors these days." But Daniel, who had been standing behind Emily a few feet away, turned his head sharply at the mention of Harborview. His expression changed. Not smiling, not social, focused. And then, as if he'd made a decision he hadn't planned to make, he excused himself from the group around Emily and started walking toward our table. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched him coming, and for the first time that night, I wondered if my parents might have misjudged more than just my job. Daniel Brooks did not rush. That was the first thing I noticed as he crossed the ballroom floor. In a room full of fast conversations and louder laughter, he moved with the calm patience of someone who was used to people waiting for him. My father stopped mid-sentence when Daniel reached the table. "Daniel," Robert said quickly, pushing his chair back a little as if to stand. "Everything all right?" Daniel nodded politely, though his attention wasn't on my father. It was still on me. "Yes, sir," he said, offering Robert a brief handshake. "Everything's perfect." Then he turned slightly in my direction. "Olivia Carter, right?" The room around us felt smaller suddenly. Not silent, not exactly, but the kind of quiet where everyone nearby started listening without meaning to. "Yes," I said. His expression remained thoughtful, almost puzzled, as if he were trying to fit a piece into the right place. "I thought so," he said slowly. My mother leaned forward, smiling brightly, again, eager to reclaim the moment. "Oh, Daniel, Olivia's just being modest tonight," Diane said. "She runs a little cleaning service around Savannah. Keeps her busy." The words landed with the same soft dismissal they had carried all evening. Daniel didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me again, more carefully this time. "Harbor Shine Services," he said, not as a question, as recognition. I felt my grip tighten slightly around my wine glass. "Yes," I said, "that's the name." My father chuckled lightly beside him. "See," Robert said, "busy girl." But Daniel's gaze hadn't moved. "I've seen that name before," he continued. Across the table, Margaret Whitfield glanced between us with growing interest. "Oh," she said. Daniel nodded, though his voice remained measured, as if he were thinking through something in real time. "I spend a lot of time at the Harborview properties downtown," he said. "Our company owns part of the development there." That explained the earlier comment from one of his friends. Staff badges. My mind replayed the memory instantly. Dozens of Harbor Shine employees wearing those badges while managing cleaning contracts across several buildings. But before I could say anything, my father leaned forward again. "Harborview," Robert said, sounding amused. "That place is enormous." "It is," Daniel replied calmly. My mother gave a small laugh. "Well, Olivia certainly isn't running something like that," she said lightly. "She's just cleaning houses." The phrase hung in the air again. Just cleaning houses. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He glanced briefly toward the dance floor, where Emily was laughing with one of her bridesmaids, unaware of the conversation unfolding behind her. Then his attention returned to me. Not judgmental, not dismissive, evaluating. "I might be mistaken," he said after a pause. The words sounded polite, but his eyes suggested otherwise. "But I'm fairly certain Harbor Shine handles maintenance for at least 2 Harborview office towers." My father blinked. "That right," Robert said. Daniel shrugged slightly. "I'd have to double-check." The conversation should have ended there. It almost did. Someone at another table called Daniel's name, asking him to come join a toast for the bride and groom. He stepped back from the table, but before turning away, he looked at me once more, longer this time, as if confirming a suspicion he hadn't fully voiced. "Excuse me," he said. Then he walked back toward the center of the ballroom where Emily waited. The music swelled again, and the room returned to its celebration. But something had shifted. My father leaned back in his chair with a faint scoff. "Big developments like Harborview don't deal with small operations," he muttered. My mother nodded in agreement. "Exactly." I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into my purse and touched the edge of the Harbor Shine badge again. Across the room, Daniel had rejoined Emily near the dance floor. But even from a distance, I could tell he wasn't fully paying attention to the music or the guests. Once more, his eyes moved across the ballroom and stopped when they found me. I slipped out onto the balcony just after the cake was cut. Inside, the ballroom had grown warmer, louder. Too many bodies, too much perfume, too many smiles that didn't reach people's eyes. The night air hit my face like a clean cloth, cool and sharp, off the harbor. Below Charleston's lights spread along the water in gold lines. Boats rocked gently in their slips, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang soft enough that it could have been my imagination. I leaned both hands on the railing and let myself breathe. Not cry. I refused to give them that. Behind me, the glass doors opened. I didn't turn right away. I assumed it was another guest, looking for quiet, or maybe one of the waiters stepping out for a quick break. Then I heard his voice. Olivia Daniel Brooks stood a few feet away. His jacket, unbuttoned tie, loosened slightly, like even he couldn't stay perfect all night. Up close, he looked less like the polished groom in the photographs, and more like a man carrying too many thoughts. "You're supposed to be inside," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "So are you?" he replied, not unkindly. Silence settled between us, the kind that isn't empty, just waiting. He stepped closer, stopping at a polite distance. "I hope you don't think I was trying to embarrass anyone back there." "I don't," I said. "My parents don't need help embarrassing me." His expression tightened just slightly. "That's not how it should be." I gave a small shrug, as if it didn't matter, as if the words hadn't been sitting in my chest all night like something heavy. Daniel's eyes flicked down to my purse, to the strap pressed against my shoulder. "Do you have your badge with you?" he asked suddenly. The question startled me. "Why?" He hesitated, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "Because I've seen it before," he said. "Harbor Shine. That name isn't new to me." My fingers moved without thinking, opening my purse just enough to pull out the slim plastic badge, clipped to a short lanyard. Harbor Shine Services. My name, a small logo I'd paid a designer for 3 years ago when I could barely afford it. Daniel's face shifted into certainty. "That's it," he murmured. I stared at him. "You're sure you're not confusing it with another vendor?" "No," he said firmly. "I know that logo." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face as he tapped quickly, scrolling through emails the way someone does when they're used to finding answers in writing. "This is going to sound strange," he said, glancing up at me, "but my company uses Harbor Shine at Harborview." My throat tightened. "Your company?" Daniel nodded. "Brooks Maritime Development. My father owns the warehouses, but I manage the Harborview office towers. We brought in Harbor Shine last quarter." For a second, my mind refused to catch up. Harborview was a landmark in Charleston. Glass, steel, and money. The kind of place my parents spoke about, like it was a different universe. "You're saying my company works there," I said quietly. "I'm saying your team's been there every night," Daniel answered. "And the reason I know is because I approved the contract myself." He turned his phone toward me. I didn't read every line, but I saw the subject header. I saw the attached PDF. I saw my company name, printed in clean black letters, the way it always looked when it was official. A strange, slow heat rose behind my eyes. "My parents don't know." I said the words coming out smaller than I expected. Daniel's brows lifted. "They don't know what you built?" I shook my head once. He exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that felt like disbelief. "That explains everything," he said. And for a moment, standing there, with the harbor wind between us, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I had spent years waiting for them to see me, but waiting hadn't changed anything. If anything was going to change, it would have to start with me choosing not to shrink anymore, even if it made the room uncomfortable. Inside, the band struck up another song, and the crowd cheered as Emily and Daniel returned to the center of the dance floor. Daniel looked toward the doors, then back at me. "We should talk again tomorrow," he said quietly. "There's something you deserve to hear in a room where people can't laugh it off." My stomach tightened. Tomorrow, a word that suddenly felt like a door opening and a cliff right behind it. The wedding ended late Saturday night, but Charleston was already glowing under a pale Sunday morning when I left the hotel. The harbor breeze carried the smell of salt and coffee from the cafe across the street. Guests from the reception drifted through the lobby behind me, some still wearing last night's formal clothes, their voices softer now. I had barely slept, not because of the music or the champagne or the long drive from Savannah, because of what Daniel had said on the balcony. Tomorrow. The word had followed me through the night. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the key, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Inside my purse, the Harbor Shine badge pressed lightly against the leather. For years, that badge had meant something very simple to me. Work. Early mornings. Contracts printed on cheap paper because I couldn't afford better. And the quiet understanding that no one outside my small circle would ever notice what we were building. I pulled onto the road just as the sun climbed above the Charleston skyline. The drive back to Savannah took a little over 2 hours. I had done it dozens of times before, sometimes at 5 in the morning when a new contract needed supervision, sometimes late at night after finishing paperwork at a client's office. Today, the road felt different. He knows. The thought repeated itself like a slow drumbeat. Daniel Brooks knew the name Harbor Shine. Not as a joke, not as something small, as a company, as a contract, as a line in a business report. When I reached Savannah, the city was just beginning to wake up. Church bells echoed across the historic district, and a few early pedestrians walked dogs along the oak-lined sidewalks. Harbor Shine's office sat in a renovated brick building on Whitaker Street. Nothing fancy, just 2 small floors and a narrow parking lot in the back. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quiet familiarity steadied me. The scent of cleaning supplies, fresh paper and coffee filled the air. 3 years ago, this had been a single desk and a folding chair. Now, there were 6 workstations, a storage room full of equipment, and a wall covered in job schedules, pinned neatly in rows. "Morning, boss." The voice came from the hallway. Maria Alvarez stepped into the office, carrying a clipboard. She had been with Harbor Shine almost from the beginning, a former hotel housekeeper who had taken a chance on my small company when there were barely enough hours to guarantee. "You're back early," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I thought the fancy wedding was all weekend." "It was," I said. Maria studied my face for a moment. She had the kind of instincts you only develop after years of reading people's moods, in hotel hallways, in service corridors. "Something happened?" she asked. "Not exactly." I placed my purse on the desk and pulled out the Harbor Shine badge, setting it beside the day's schedule. The familiar logo stared back at me. "I need to review the Harborview files," I said. Maria blinked. "Charleston Harborview?" "Yes." Her surprise was understandable. Harborview was one of our biggest contracts, night crews, cleaning office towers that overlooked the water. "You worried about something?" she asked. "No," I said slowly. But the word didn't feel entirely true, because for the first time since signing that contract, the work we had done quietly in the background had stepped into a room full of people who didn't expect it. And those people included my family. Maria flipped through her clipboard. The teams were there last night. Everything went smoothly. "I know," I said. What I didn't say was that the contract itself might soon stop being invisible. If Daniel chose to say something, or if I did. Outside the office window, the morning sun spread across the Savannah rooftops. For years, I had kept Harborshine separate from my family's expectations. Small business, cleaning houses, nothing impressive. It had been easier that way. But standing in that quiet office, looking at the schedules that represented dozens of jobs and livelihoods, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Something steadier, a decision forming. If the truth about Harborshine was going to enter that Charleston ballroom again, it wouldn't happen by accident. This time, it would happen because I chose it. Was quieter than the reception. 2 nights too was quieter than the reception 2 nights before. Fewer champagne toasts, more coffee cups, and polite conversation. Still elegant. Still full of people who paid attention to status. I stood just inside the entrance, holding a slim folder against my side. The Harborshine badge rested inside, clipped neatly to the first page of printed documents. Daniel had asked if I would come. Just be there, he had said over the phone the night before. You won't need to say much. That promise had not stopped the tension in my chest. Across the room, Emily sat beside Daniel at the head table speaking with several relatives who had extended their trip. My parents were nearby already, surrounded by a cluster of Daniel's business contacts. Robert Carter's voice carried easily across the room. Charleston has always been good for business, he was saying, laughing comfortably. Daniel's family knows how to do things right. My mother nodded proudly beside him. They had no idea why I was there. I walked quietly to one of the tables near the side wall, choosing a seat where I could see both the stage and the head table. Margaret Whitfield noticed me first. She offered a small, knowing smile before returning to her coffee. The brunch program began with a slideshow of wedding photos on a large projection screen. Emily and Daniel walking along the harbor docks, Emily laughing beneath the white lights of the reception. Applause followed each image. After a few minutes, Daniel rose from his chair. The room quieted quickly. He stepped toward the microphone at the front of the ballroom, adjusting it slightly before speaking. I'd like to thank everyone for staying through the weekend, he began. Our families and friends mean a great deal to us. Polite smiles circled the room. Behind him, the slideshow faded to a blank screen. I also wanted to take a moment to recognize a partnership that's been important to our company over the past year. That line drew the attention of several businessmen in the room. My father leaned forward in his chair. Daniel nodded toward the projector. The screen flickered back to life. But instead of wedding photos, a clean corporate slide appeared. A familiar blue logo. Harborshine Services. A murmur moved through the room. At the head table, my mother's smile faltered slightly. Daniel continued calmly. As many of you know, Brooks Maritime Development oversees several commercial properties along the Charleston waterfront. He paused just long enough for the businessmen in the room to nod. Maintaining buildings of that scale requires reliable partners. Charts replace the logo, cleaning schedules, service reports, photographs of spotless office lobbies and polished glass corridors. I heard one of the Harborview investors whisper to the man beside him, "That's the contractor team from the towers." At the head table, my father shifted uncomfortably. "What is this about?" he muttered. Daniel didn't look at him. Instead, he faced the room. "The company, responsible for much of that work," he said, "is Harborshine Services." The name lingered in the air. Several guests glanced around, trying to place it. Then Daniel added something that changed the room completely. "And the founder of Harborshine happens to be here this morning." Every conversation stopped. My father's chair creaked as he turned toward the crowd. My mother looked confused, scanning the tables. For a moment, no one moved. Daniel's eyes lifted from the podium. They settled directly on me. Across the ballroom, dozens of heads turned at the same time. I could feel the weight of the folder in my hands. The Harbor Shine badge pressed faintly through the paper. The truth was no longer waiting quietly in a purse or an office drawer. It was standing in the middle of the room, and now everyone was looking for it. For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom held its breath. Dozens of faces turned slowly in my direction, some curious, some confused, a few already trying to remember where they had heard the name Harborshine before. Daniel stood at the podium, calm and patient, giving the silence room to stretch. I realized then that this moment, the one I had spent years imagining in quieter ways, had arrived far faster than I had ever planned. My chair scraped softly against the floor as I stood. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Margaret Whitfield watched me rise with quiet understanding. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Across the room, my father frowned, trying to follow the direction of everyone's gaze. Then he saw me. At first, confusion crossed his face, then disbelief. I walked toward the front of the room, the folder steady in my hands. The Harbor Shine badge, pressed through the paper, a small rectangle that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had carried before. Daniel stepped aside from the microphone as I approached. For a second, we stood near each other in silence. He gave a slight nod. Not encouragement, recognition. I set the folder on the podium and opened it. Inside were the documents I had printed the day before: contract summaries, service schedules, letters of recommendation from property managers who had worked with Harbor Shine for years. Nothing dramatic, just proof. I didn't plan to speak today, I said, my voice carrying across the quiet room. But it didn't shake. That presentation already said most of what matters. A few people shifted in their seats. I looked toward the head table. Emily sat frozen beside Daniel's empty chair. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. My mother's smile had vanished completely. My father stared at me like he was looking at someone he had never met. For the past 6 years, I continued, I've been building Harbor Shine services. I gestured lightly toward the screen behind me, where the company logo still glowed. We started with 2 employees in a used van. Soft murmurs moved through the audience. Today, Harbor Shine manages cleaning and facility services for several commercial properties along the South Carolina coast. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because the room had become completely still. Harborview, someone near the front, whispered. I nodded slightly. Yes. My father leaned forward abruptly. That can't be right, he said under his breath, though the microphone carried the words farther than he intended. Daniel didn't look at him, but several of his business associates did. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit I recognized from the Harborview meetings, raised his hand slightly. That's correct, he said. My firm oversees the northern tower. Harbor Shine's crews have been handling our floors for months. Another voice joined from a nearby table. They've been excellent. The quiet shifted, not into applause, into something more thoughtful. The kind of silence people hold when a story they thought they understood suddenly changes shape. My father sat back slowly, color rising in his face. My mother looked down at her folded napkin. For the first time since the wedding began, no one at their table was laughing. I closed the folder gently. This isn't about proving anyone wrong, I said. It was the truth, or at least part of it. It's simply the work my team and I have done. Daniel stepped forward again beside the podium. Thank you, Olivia, he said calmly. But the moment didn't end when he spoke, because the room had already started to move in a new direction. Several of the business guests leaned toward each other, exchanging quiet comments. One of them stood and walked toward me. Then another. Questions were forming. Conversations were shifting. And at the head table, my parents were sitting in the same chairs where they had laughed 2 nights earlier. Only now, the room was listening to someone else. The brunch didn't return to wedding photos after that. It couldn't. The room had shifted too far, like a floorboard that finally snapped after years of quiet pressure. People came to me in a steady line, business guests first, then relatives, then the polite strangers who had laughed 2 nights earlier and now looked careful with every word. A man I recognized from Harborview's northern tower introduced himself again, this time with more respect than familiarity. He asked about our staffing model, our safety checks, how we handled after-hours access in high-security buildings. Questions that mattered. Questions no one had ever asked me in my parents' living room. I answered calmly, keeping my voice even. Not because I felt calm, but because I had learned long ago that confidence in rooms like this wasn't something you begged for. It was something you carried. Maria's face flashed in my mind, her clipboard, her steady hands, along with the women on my night cruise who had trusted me with their paychecks and their pride. This wasn't just my name on a slide. It was theirs, too. Across the ballroom, my parents stayed in their seats. They didn't move toward me. They didn't smile. My father's jaw tightened, as if he were holding back an argument he couldn't win. My mother kept smoothing her napkin over and over, the way she did when she was nervous in church. Emily sat stiffly beside Daniel, her hands folded so tightly I could see her knuckles blanch. She looked at me once, then away, as if she didn't know which version of me she was allowed to recognize. Daniel remained near the podium, letting the room do what it needed to do. He wasn't performing, he was watching. At one point, Margaret Whitfield approached my parents' table. She didn't sit. She didn't soften her tone. She simply leaned in and said something I couldn't hear. But I saw my mother's face change. I saw my father blink rapidly, like his eyes had begun to sting. A moment later, 2 of Daniel's business associates, men my father had been trying to impress all weekend, stood and walked straight to me. One of them asked for my card. I handed him one from my folder. His eyes flicked to the Harbor Shine logo and then back to my face. "We've been discussing vendor consolidation for next quarter," he said. "If you handle Harborview the way you do, we should talk." The second man nodded. "We've got 2 properties in Mount Pleasant. Our current contractor has been inconsistent." Their voices weren't loud, but they carried. People nearby heard. My father heard. I watched him straighten in his chair, shoulders pulling back, as if he wanted to reclaim the control he had lost. But he couldn't. Not with those men standing in front of me. Not with Daniel's name behind the contract. Not with the room watching. This was the karma my parents never expected. Not punishment, exposure. The very people they valued most, businessmen, community leaders, the kind of guests they believed mattered, were now looking at them with quiet confusion. Because they had laughed at the wrong daughter. And the evidence was standing in front of everyone. When the questions finally slowed, I stepped slightly aside to breathe. That's when my mother stood. She walked toward me carefully, as if the floor might shift beneath her. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was lower than I had ever heard it in public. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. The question wasn't angry. It was frightened. I looked at her, truly looked, and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. "I tried," I said. "You never asked." My father rose behind her, still stiff, still proud enough to resist the moment, even as it swallowed him whole. "We didn't know," he muttered. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held his gaze. "And now you do." The words were small, but in that room they landed like a final gavel. Around us, the brunch continued in low murmurs, the kind of murmurs that change reputations quietly, one sentence at a time. And I knew the hardest part wasn't that my parents had been wrong. It was that they had been wrong in front of everyone they'd ever wanted to impress. 3 months later, the Charleston harbor looked different. Not because the water had changed, but because I had. The late afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of Harborview as I stepped out of the elevator on the 20th floor. Through the windows, the Atlantic stretched in pale blue lines, beyond the docks cargo ships moving slowly toward open water. Harbor Shine crews had already finished the day's work in the lobby below. The marble floors shone with the same quiet perfection they had every night for months. Only now, people knew who made them shine. My meeting with the Harborview Property Board had ended an hour earlier. 2 new service contracts sat neatly signed inside the leather folder under my arm, Mount Pleasant, and another tower just north of the harbor. Growth that once would have taken years had arrived in weeks. Not because of revenge, because the truth had finally stepped into the same room where the lies used to live. I walked toward the window, setting the folder on the conference table. The Harbor Shine badge rested on top, the small blue logo catching the light. A quiet knock came at the open door. Daniel Brooks leaned against the frame, sleeves rolled up like the formal wedding version of him had finally retired. "Thought you might still be here," he said. "Just finishing up," I replied. He stepped inside, glancing toward the skyline. "You handled that morning better than most people would have." I smiled faintly. "It wasn't about winning." "No," he said. "It wasn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed quietly below. "How are your parents?" he asked eventually. The question lingered between us. "They're learning," I said, which was the truth. The first few weeks after the brunch had been uncomfortable for everyone. Phone calls that started awkwardly, conversations where my parents sounded unsure of the ground beneath their own words. My father spoke less confidently now when he talked about success. My mother listened more, and when they introduced me to people these days, the sentence had changed. "This is our daughter, Olivia. She built Harbor Shine Services." No just. No shrinking. Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds like progress." "Maybe," I said. But the real change hadn't happened in their voices. It had happened in mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain myself inside rooms like this. I walked to the window again, looking out over the buildings Harbor Shine now maintained every night. Each tower reflected a piece of the sky. Each polished floor carried the work of the women who had trusted me to build something worth standing on. Justice, I had learned, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived in quiet recognition. Sometimes it arrived in the moment when the people who once made you feel small had to stand in the same room while the truth stood taller. Behind me, Daniel picked up the Harbor Shine badge from the table. "You should frame this someday," he said lightly. I took it back, sliding the badge into my purse. "No," I said. "This one still has work to do." Outside the harbor, wind moved across the glass towers, and for the first time, standing in a room that once would have intimidated me, I felt something steady and peaceful settle in my chest. Not victory, something better, belonging. Because the sweetest kind of revenge isn't humiliation. It's the quiet moment when you realize you no longer need anyone's permission to stand tall. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone underestimated you, share it in the comments. Stories like these remind us that dignity often grows quietly before the world finally notices. And if you enjoy stories about justice, family, and second chances, consider subscribing and joining us for the next one.